Hi folks, David Stewart here. So here's a question I get quite frequently, which is what kind of strings should I use on my guitar? Or what's the difference between these high tension strings and the low tension strings and the thicker strings and the thinner strings? And what does it all mean? And how do I pick good strings for my guitar? And the most accurate answer that I can give is usually it's a matter of personal preference and the guitar that you're using. But that's not a very helpful answer, especially when you're looking for a starting point to exploring different kinds of string sets and figuring out what kind of strings you want to use on your guitar. So what I thought I'd do is I'd give you sort of a big kind of broad summary of some of the points about different kinds of guitar strings. This video is going to focus exclusively on classical guitar strings, and I will talk about steel strings, electric guitar strings, and acoustic guitar strings in some other video. This one's going to talk exclusively about classical guitar strings. Now, classical guitar strings, unlike steel guitar strings, come not in a size measurement. Like when you pick up a set of electric guitar strings, they'll have a measurement usually of the first string. It'll be 0.010 or something like that. That tells you how thick that string is. Well, classical guitar strings do not adhere to that. They use tension measurements. And the reason they use tension measurements is you may have one brand of strings has smaller strings than another brand of strings, and yet those smaller strings are at a higher tension. Whereas with steel strings, the thickness of the string corresponds almost directly to how much tension is on the string. The thicker the string, obviously, the more tension you have to put on the string for it to vibrate at the correct pitch. So classical guitar strings, there's more variety in the thickness of the strings because there's more variety in the materials being used to produce the strings. These are, nylon strings and silk and silvered steel sort of strings, but there's other materials that you may make them out of. The strings that I usually use, Savara's Alliance HT Classics, are a high tension string, but they're smaller in diameter than these strings, which are actually low tension strings that I'm using on this guitar, or normal tension strings. So the thickness doesn't end up corresponding, and that's because the Savaras are made out of a little bit different set of materials. The nylon strings are not pure nylon. They're nylon mixed with some other composite materials to produce a thinner, brighter string. And all those different materials things, they're going to have a different impact on the tone. So I feel like with classical guitar, there's a lot of room for experimentation. What's the difference between high, medium, and low? What does high, medium, and low tension mean? Well, unfortunately, there's not a good standard. It varies by brand. Some brands, high tension strings are very hard to push down. Other brands, the high tension strings are easier to push down. Labella has a string tension chart that they put out that I think is very helpful, except if you're not using Labella strings, in which case it's not that helpful because another brand is going to have a different sort of qualification for what hard tension or high tension actually means. So you're going to have to do a little bit of experimentation, but let me give you some general ideas about it. Higher tension strings are going to feel differently than lower tension strings, and they're going to sound different as well. And these are sort of generalizations, and they'll vary by brand, and they'll vary by the materials being used even within a brand. Higher tension strings, one of the things you might notice about classical guitar strings, if you pick up a classical guitar, especially with normal or very low tension strings, when you try to bend one of the bass strings, you may notice that it rolls around under your finger a little bit. Whereas with a steel guitar string, you don't have that rolling action. When you pull down on the steel guitar string, it just moves. This one kind of rolls like it's like a barrel kind of rolling around underneath your fingers, which means your finger can slip off the string very easily. So if you have a higher tension string, they don't roll around under your fingers as much. That can make doing certain things a little easier, like doing a lot of hammer-ons and pull-offs. So if you're doing a lot of hammer-ons and pull-offs, that higher tension set may feel a little snappier under the fingers. That's why a lot of flamenco players like to play with hard tension strings, because when you're doing a lot of different hammer-ons and pull-offs, having that sort of roll underneath the finger doesn't really feel that good. So a higher tension string will kind of offset that. Now, that being said, the higher tension strings are usually harder to push down. A hard tension string requires more effort to be used to bend the string down to meet the fret. So it's going to feel a little harder on the left hand. That can be offset by having lower action. The lower your action, the less energy you have to use to push that string all the way to where it meets the fret, which in turn means it's going to be easier to play. The flip side of that is that the closer the strings are to the fret, the more they're going to buzz. Okay, so if you're playing a flamenco guitar with fairly low action, the hard tension strings, you already know that there's a certain amount of buzzing with that guitar. And the high tension strings might feel really good on the left hand, and you might be okay with the buzzing. Another thing to consider is low tension strings, or strings on the lower tension scale of the side. Normal tension, low tension. They actually move more when they're being played. So if I get this guitar very close and play a note, you'll see it going back and forth. See how far it moves? Hopefully you can see it on the camera, how far that string might move. If I do it from here, you can really see how far that string flops back and forth. Well, high tension strings travel back up and down much less when they're being played. They have a tighter vibration, which in turn can actually have a subtle effect on what you're doing. If you feel like the string is like, getting muted slightly, a higher tension string may cut down on that. You may just want less string vibration up and around when you're playing. It may buzz less actually when you use higher tension strings, because that travel, it's not going to be knocking against the fret and creating a subtle buzz. So higher tension strings can actually have less buzz on a guitar with the same action, which is something interesting. Also, higher tension strings will feel a little bit tighter on the right hand. On the right hand, there's usually quite a bit of give when you're trying to play, a scale passage. Higher tension strings are going to have less give, which is going to give it a little more positive response for the right hand when you're trying to play piccato. If you don't want to use higher tension strings for fast piccato, normally you have to play kind of close to the bridge, a little more, Ponticello. But if you want the tosto sound when you're playing piccato stuff and you want to use a higher tension string, that'll help you achieve that different tone while you're playing fast. So there's some benefits. The downside is they're harder to push on the left hand. The other thing about string tension is they have a little bit different sound envelope. What you might hear a lot of people say is the normal tension strings have more sustain, and the higher tension strings have less sustain and more attack. And that's partially true. In my experience, I don't feel like the high tension strings have less sustain. I feel like their sustain is pretty much the same, but the sustain sounds different because of the sound envelope. And if you've ever programmed synthesizers, you probably know what a sound envelope is. But for those of you who haven't, what a sound envelope is the time that it takes for any sort of sound to reach maximum energy and then decay. And what we're talking about with maximum energy is really loudness, amplitude. So if you imagine a graph, and the y-axis is amplitude and the x-axis is time, a typical sound envelope, it takes a certain amount of time for the maximum sound output to reach, and then it's going to decay, at least with any sort of instrument you're playing and letting it sustain, like the piano or guitar. Obviously, if you're playing a trumpet, you don't have to worry about sound envelopes. There is one, but you don't really have to think about it as much. So I feel like higher tension strings have a little quicker attack. They reach that maximum amplitude, that maximum volume, a little bit quicker. And they also decay away from that maximum volume a little bit quicker as well. This makes people think that they have less sustain, but in my experience, they don't have less sustain. They just have a faster decay to their sustain point. Now, if you listen to me play this, there's a quick attack, and then we get to what's called the overall sustain level. Quick attack, quick decay, and then we have a long sustaining tail. With higher tension strings, you're going to get to that long sustaining tail, but it's going to sound quieter by comparison to that initial attack. And that's because when you have something strung up with higher tension, there's more stored energy in it, which means when you strike it, it's going to be louder. Higher tension strings are a little bit louder. They're not the only thing that affects volume. That's not correct, but they do tend to, on the same guitar, make it a little bit louder. That attack is going to be louder. So you're going to have a sound envelope that attacks quickly and then goes down quickly, versus normal strings where it attacks a little slower and decays a little slower to finally reaching that sustain point where it's slowly decaying to zero. Okay, so the sound envelope is different. Your choice of strings according to that, to the tone, to the sound envelope, not the tone, but the sound envelope, can vary a lot depending on what sort of music you're playing. If you're playing something like flamenco, you're not going to care that much about the faster decay. If you're playing very, very active classical music, you're not going to care that much about the decay. And If you're playing something that has a lot of sustain or a lot of like, a lot of counterpoint where notes are kind of bleeding over into each other, or you're playing at a slow tempo, a normal tension string might end up producing a little bit better effect for you. I don't think that's 100% though. When I'm playing, I play on predominantly on high tension strings for all the benefits that I think they give my playing. When I'm playing something slower and more reflective, I tend to ease up on the attack a little bit, play a little more tosto, and that kind of, for me, evens out that sound envelope. The last thing that you have to consider when you're choosing what strings you want to get is the tone themselves. Higher tension strings have a different tone than lower tension strings overall. Again, these are just general things. They vary by brand quite a bit. So a high tension string to me is brighter, which means it has more high frequencies. The high frequencies are a little stronger, and that has to do with the amount of energy that you have stored in the string. Higher frequencies have more energy in them, so if you have a tighter string, that's going to help those higher frequencies to sort of speak out very strongly. At least that's how I experience it. And the lower end is going to be, I hate to use like nebulous terms, but it's tighter. And what that really means to me is that the low end has a very even sort of response. It doesn't woof or things like that. It's not over loud. It's a nice even response. And what I get down to when I'm doing normal tension strings is basically that bottom end is a little bit looser, which in turn makes the mid ranges speak a little bit more. So I feel like the normal tension strings tend to have a little bit more in the mid-range department, and the high tension strings tend to have a little bit more highs and a little bit more lows. So you end up kind of picking tones around that. So if you feel like you need a little bit more mid-range energy, or you like more vocal quality to the notes you're sustaining, normal tension strings may provide that for you. But it varies totally. I guess this is the last part. It varies a lot by your guitar. Your guitar, the sound of your guitar is the sound of your guitar, and the strings that you add to it, they will affect the sound, but not as profoundly as people think they will. People think that they affect the sound wildly, and that's not really the case. They affect the sound in more or less subtle ways, but the feel of the strings is the main thing. So if you feel like you're okay pressing a little harder on the strings and you want a snappier feel on the left hand, a little bit more solid feel on the right hand, higher tension strings might be for you. If you're just starting out on the guitar, I do recommend staying on normal tension, not low tension, but normal tension strings for at least a while till you get used to playing, because they offer the biggest balance, right? They're not that hard to push down, but they also don't flop around as much. It's a good set of strings to practice and learn on, is a normal tension string. So I hope that's helpful. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know what you want to see and what you want to hear. I'm always happy to deliver if I have time to do it. Sometimes I don't have time to do it. It takes forever, but I do my best to honor requests. So thanks so much, and you guys have a great day.